Why did everyone already believe she would fail? The question clung to the morning air as Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the Fort Benning parade ground. Dawn light spilled thin and gray across the field, catching the edges of soldiers, boots, and the gleam of rifles. Around her, recruits shifted in restless silence, some stealing quick glances her way. 5'2", barely over 100 pounds, she looked more like a lost college freshman than a soldier about to begin basic training. Nobody said it out loud, but Sarah could read the verdict in their eyes. What is she doing here? A sharp whistle tore through the low hum of conversation. Sergeant Williams strode across the asphalt, a mountain of a man whose presence seemed to press the air flat. He scanned the lineup, eyes hard and assessing. When they found Sarah, they paused, just long enough for her to feel the weight of it. A tiny shake of his head, almost imperceptible but enough to slice. Then his voice, gravel over steel, "Move." She moved, heart hammering. Inside, she whispered the words she had carried for weeks. "You chose this. You stay." The run began before the sun had fully climbed the tree line. Boots pounded the damp Georgia soil in perfect rhythm, a thunderous tide of determination. Sarah's legs churned, breath catching almost immediately. Within minutes the formation surged ahead, a living river she couldn't match. Her lungs burned, sweat gathered beneath her collar. And soon she was alone, her footfalls a lonely echo behind the pack. At the checkpoint the others jogged in place, hardly winded. One recruit checked his watch with theatrical patience. Another muttered just loud enough, "We'll be here all day." A ripple of soft laughter followed, not cruel exactly, but sharp enough to cut. That night the barracks were a chorus of snores and slow breathing. Sarah lay awake, eyes tracing the shadowed ceiling. The memory of their smirks burned hotter than the ache in her legs. Maybe they were right, maybe she didn't belong here. Her father's voice floated from some distant place, his marine grit wrapped in love. "Strength isn't in the muscle, Sarah. It's in the heart." She turned on her side, jaw tight. She wasn't leaving, not like this. Days blurred into a rhythm of sweat and doubt. Push-ups that left her arms trembling. Obstacle walls that seemed to stretch higher each time she faced them. Drill sergeants who barked at others but merely sighed at her, as if effort on their part was wasted. When she lagged on the long ruck marches, nobody offered a hand. They just waited at the next checkpoint, boots tapping, eyes cold. Yet somewhere inside the grind, a different rhythm took root. Small, steady, her own. She learned to start running before the whistle so she could finish with the group. She found handholds others missed on the climbing walls, using leverage instead of brute force. She disassembled and reassembled her rifle until the motion felt like breathing, her times faster than anyone in the platoon. At the end of each day, while others slumped against bunks, she cleaned every piece of gear until it gleamed, checking each strap and buckle as if her life already depended on it. Still, the whispers persisted. Liability. Dead weight. Someone you'd never trust in a firefight. She said nothing, she never did, but something in her eyes began to change, a flicker that even the season could sense. Letters from home came once a week, her mother's soft concern threaded between the lines. "Are you sure this is right for you?" Her father's words steadier, but no less questioning. He offered encouragement, yet Sarah read the doubt between sentences. It hurt more than the blisters, that quiet fear from the people who loved her most. But the memory of her grandfather steadied her. He'd served in World War II and told her, over and over, that true strength wasn't about size. It was about the size of the fight inside you. He used to tap her chest lightly with one thick finger, "Right here, that's where it lives." Every dawn she laced her boots with those words echoing. Every dusk she unrolled her sleeping bag with a simple vow, "One more day. I stay one more day." When Sergeant Williams rotated out and Sergeant Rodriguez took over, the shift was subtle but immediate. Rodriguez was quieter, eyes like a hawk's, and he noticed things the others missed. He never softened the training. If anything, he was more demanding, but he watched. Really watched. He saw how she helped a bunkmate study for the written exams after lights out. How she volunteered for the grimiest details without complaint. How she never once made excuses for her slower times. And he saw that flicker in her eyes, the one that said she was playing a longer game than anyone else realized. Rodriguez had served 20 years. He knew that the toughest soldiers weren't always the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes they were the ones who kept their heads down, taking every hit, refusing to quit. By the time autumn crept across the pines, Sarah had found a rhythm that belonged only to her. She was still slow, yes, but steady. She had stopped caring about the eye rolls and whispered jokes. Even the barracks' laughter lost its edge when it failed to draw a reaction. Then came the briefing that would test them all. The final field exercise, 5 days deep in the mountains. Navigation, survival, a demonstration of everything they had learned. A mission designed to break the careless and reveal the strong. Rodriguez gathered the unit in the chill of early morning. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. You will rely on each other. You will carry more than gear. Out there you carry your team. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a heartbeat longer than the rest. No smile, no warning, just a look that said, I see you. She felt the message settle like a stone in her chest. She nodded once barely, and he moved on. The night before departure buzzed with nervous energy. Some soldiers boasted about how easy it would be. Others sat quiet, eyes on their packs, the reality of 5 days in cold wilderness beginning to sink in. Sarah methodically checked her gear, rations, navigation tools, extra socks sealed against the rain. Every strap cinched, every buckle tested. Preparation was the only advantage she could give herself. She moved through the tasks like a ritual, a calm center amid the rising chatter. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy. The scent of pine mixed with the faint metallic promise of rain. Morning broke with a muted light and a drizzle that felt colder than it should. They loaded into the transport trucks, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Sarah found a seat beside Private Johnson, a broad-shouldered powerhouse who had been the loudest skeptic of her abilities. Today he was quiet, staring out the window at the mountains that waited. Neither spoke. The ride wound upward for nearly 2 hours, the road narrowing until trees leaned close like silent sentries. When the trucks finally halted, the recruits stepped into a world of stone and mist. The air smelled of wet earth and challenge. Rodriguez unfolded a map against the hood of a vehicle. Checkpoint 8 miles. You know the drill, stay together, stay sharp. His eyes swept the group. No one gets left behind. Sarah adjusted her pack straps and fell into line. The march began. Predictably, the taller soldiers stretched the distance early, their strides long and confident. Sarah stayed at the rear, her pace steady, deliberate. She knew better than to chase. It wasn't speed that won endurance marches, it was rhythm. Her rhythm. The drizzle thickened to a cold mist, clinging to hair and gear. Boots slipped on wet rock. Breath turned to steam. As miles passed, the mountains swallowed them whole. Trees gave way to granite outcrops, the trail narrowing to single file. Occasionally Rodriguez glanced back, his expression unreadable. She met his gaze once, offered the briefest nod. Still here. Around midday the sky darkened further, a quiet threat of what lay ahead. But for now there was only the sound of boots on stone, and the silent questions each soldier carried. Am I ready? Will I hold up when it matters? Sarah had no answer yet. Only the quiet promise she carried every dawn, One more step, one more day. None of them, not the quickest, not the strongest, not even Rodriguez himself, knew that before this exercise was over, the smallest soldier among them would bear the greatest weight of all. What waited beyond that next bend in the trail? The question whispered through the trees as the unit moved higher into the mountains, their boots sinking into slick earth. Mist draped the forest like a shroud. Pine needles glistened with cold rain, and the air smelled of stone and moss. The promised 8 miles to the first checkpoint stretched longer with every step, as if the mountain itself was testing their resolve. Sarah kept her rhythm, small steps, steady breath. The drizzle had soaked through her jacket hours ago, but she hardly noticed. Around her, the stronger soldiers grumbled under their packs, shoulders aching. Private Johnson's broad back, once a symbol of untouchable strength, now bowed slightly beneath the weight. No one spoke much. The silence became its own language, the hiss of wet leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the soft scuff of boots on rock. Above them, the sky lowered until it seemed to press against the ridges. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed to a knife-edge path that wound between jagged boulders. Rodriguez called a halt. His eyes moved over the group, sharp and calm. "Hydrate 10 minutes," he said. Soldiers dropped their packs with audible groans. Sarah eased hers down, stretching her cramped shoulders. Across the group, Johnson wiped rain from his brow, his face pale beneath the dirt. He caught her looking and gave a tight nod, an acknowledgement, nothing more. Small, but it was something. When the break ended, they pressed on. Darkness began to pool under the trees, swallowing the trail. The first checkpoint appeared like a ghost, a weathered signpost beside a clearing slick with mud. They set camp quickly, the routine now muscle memory. Tents sprang up. Fires sputtered. The air filled with the scent of damp wood and instant rations. Rodriguez moved among them silently, inspecting knots, testing the security of tent lines. When he reached Sarah's station, he paused. "You always double-check," he said quietly. "Yes, Sergeant," she replied, unsure if it was a question or a compliment. A faint smile flickered across his face. "Smart, mountains punish sloppy." It wasn't praise exactly, but it carried weight. Sarah nodded once, heart warming against the chill. That night rain drummed the tent roof in steady rhythm. Around her, soldiers muttered in uneasy sleep. Sarah lay awake, listening to the storm and the distant groan of trees. Tomorrow's route would be harder. Rodriguez had said so during the evening briefing. Steeper climbs, sharper drops, narrow passes where a single misstep could end more than the exercise. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breath, the way she had in college during endless nights of study and uncertainty. One more day, she told herself. One more step. Morning came like a gray exhale. The storm hadn't broken. It had settled in, a cold rain that seeped into everything. Rodriguez's voice cut through the mist at dawn. "Pack up, we move." The trail quickly turned vicious. Wet stone, sudden inclines, narrow switchbacks that forced single-file movement. Packs felt heavier by the mile, straps digging into shoulders. Even the strongest among them slowed. But Sarah, small, deliberate, found an odd advantage. Her lighter frame made her surer on the slippery rocks. Her careful pace, once mocked, now became an asset. While others cursed each treacherous step, she moved with measured confidence, eyes scanning each foothold. Private Williams, usually first in line, slipped twice and caught himself with a sharp hiss. "Watch it," Sarah warned softly, almost without thinking. He glanced back, surprise flashing before a grudging nod. "Yeah, thanks." It was the first time he'd spoken to her, without an edge. By midday, the mist thickened into a cold curtain, turning the world into shifting gray. The path ahead disappeared into cloud. Rodriguez halted the column. "We take the ridge," he said, pointing to a barely visible rise. Slow and steady, eyes open. The climb was brutal. Wet rock underfoot, sheer drop to one side, the wind rising in sudden gusts. Every step demanded total focus. Sarah kept low, balanced, breathing through the burn in her thighs. Around her, curses punctuated the wind as soldiers scrambled for holds. At the top they found no view, only swirling mist and a sense of fragile triumph. They moved on. The descent proved worse. It happened fast. One moment Rodriguez was stepping carefully, his voice calm as he called back instructions. The next, a sharp crack of shifting stone echoed through the gorge. "Sergeant," someone shouted. Sarah turned in time to see him slide. Loose rocks gave way beneath his boots, sending him tumbling down the incline. He hit once, twice, then slammed against a boulder with a sound that cut through the wind, a sickening thud that froze every heart. For a breathless second, no one moved. Then chaos. "Get down there," Johnson barked, already scrambling. Soldiers clambered after him, boots skidding on slick rock. Sarah followed, her stomach knotted. Rodriguez lay twisted against the stone, face pale beneath streaks of mud. His breathing was ragged. Blood darkened the fabric at his thigh. One glance told Sarah what words soon confirmed. His leg was broken, maybe worse. "Don't move him," Private Williams said, voice shaking. "We need a medic." "No signal," Johnson snapped, waving his useless radio at the surrounding cliffs. "We're in a dead zone." Sarah crouched, eyes scanning the terrain, the sky, the faint trail that wound downward. The nearest road was miles away, 10, maybe more, through terrain already testing their limits. Rodriguez grimaced but forced his voice steady. "We need to move, can't stay here." "Move him where?" someone demanded. Silence followed, heavy as the rain. They fashioned a stretcher from ponchos and tent poles, their training taking over. Johnson and two others lifted first, muscles straining. For a while they managed, but the slope punished every step. The sergeant was no lightweight, nearly 200 pounds of dead weight on a makeshift carrier. Half a mile, progress slowed to a crawl, shoulders trembled, faces drained. After 2 hours, they had covered less than a single mile. Rodriguez's breath grew shallow, the cold bit deeper. "We're not going to make it," Williams whispered, his voice carrying the truth none wanted to say. Sarah knelt beside the stretcher, rain dripping from her helmet. She studied the map tucked inside her jacket, tracing routes with her finger, calculating. Her mind raced, quiet and sharp. Then she said it, "I can carry him." The words landed like a dropped stone. Johnson blinked. "What?" "I can carry him," she repeated, eyes steady. Laughter came first, short, disbelieving. Williams shook his head. "You can barely carry your own pack." "You weigh what, 100 pounds soaking wet," another added. Sarah ignored them, still mapping possibilities in her mind. She had watched carefully as the others lifted, noticed how they relied on sheer upper body strength, short bursts that drained them quickly. She thought of her father, years on construction sites, showing her how to lift heavy beams with the whole body, how to let legs and core take the burden. "It's not about arms," she said quietly. "It's about balance, leverage. I can do it." "No," Johnson snapped. "You'll break yourself in half." Rodriguez opened his eyes, pain shadowed but clear. "Let her try," he said. The group fell silent, rain tapped against stone. Sarah adjusted the stretcher, repositioning straps until the weight spread across her hips and back. She slid beneath, feeling the cold press of the frame against her shoulders. Her heart hammered, not from fear, but from the sheer enormity of the task. She stood. The weight hit like a wave, nearly driving her to her knees. For a heartbeat she thought they'd been right, but she breathed deep, controlled. She shifted her stance, remembering her father's lessons. Bend the knees, lock the core, find the rhythm. One step, another. The rain seemed to hush around her. Behind, Johnson muttered a curse, then jogged to her side, ready to catch her if she fell. But she didn't. She kept moving. Slow, steady, mechanical, each step a decision, each breath a calculation. Her muscles screamed, but her mind was a quiet engine. Weight through the hips, balance, breathe. Minutes stretched. The soldiers who had doubted her fell silent, their own fatigue momentarily forgotten as they watched. At a half-mile, Williams moved to take her place. She shook her head. Not yet. Another mile. The trail dipped, slick with runoff. Johnson cleared rocks ahead, calling warnings. Sarah adjusted her grip, core tight, eyes fixed on the path. Her breathing found a rhythm against the storm. 2 miles, 3. The impossible had begun to look inevitable. Night crept in, cold and unyielding. Sleet replaced rain, needling exposed skin. They had covered more distance under Sarah's steady pace than in hours of rotating teams. The other soldiers, once skeptics, now formed a protective flank around her. Johnson, her harshest critic, kept a hand near the stretcher's edge, not to take the load but to guard her path. Rodriguez, barely conscious, watched through half-lidded eyes. In the faint light, he saw something few soldiers ever witness: pure will-made flesh. The kind that doesn't break, doesn't boast, doesn't need recognition. Sarah didn't notice the awe around her. She noticed only the next step, the balance of the stretcher, the narrow trail that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. Pain had become background noise, as distant as the storm's rumble. Each mile was its own universe. She conquered them one by one. By the time the unit halted for a brief rest, Sarah had carried their sergeant farther, alone, than the combined strength of the entire team had managed in hours. And still she stood, breath heavy but eyes unwavering. Rodriguez found his voice rough and quiet. "Keep going," he said, not a command, a recognition. Sarah nodded once. And the march resumed, the mountains watching in silence as the smallest soldier bore the greatest weight into the dark. How much farther could a single body carry another? The question rode the wind as dusk bled across the mountains. A sky the color of bruised iron pressed low over the peaks, and sleet cut sideways through the trees. Every gust rattled branches like distant gunfire. The trail, a faint scar of mud and stone, seemed to vanish beneath the swirling dark. Sarah kept moving. Each step felt both infinite and immediate. The stretcher frame dug into her shoulders. Her hips burned where the straps had rubbed raw. But her breathing stayed measured, the rhythm drilled into her bones. Inhale, lift, exhale, place. Again, again. Behind her, the squad followed in a protective crescent. Johnson kept to her right, clearing fallen branches and loose rock with quick kicks. Williams ranged ahead, scanning for the next safe foothold. No one spoke above a whisper. Their world had narrowed to the sound of boots in mud and the relentless hiss of sleet. Rodriguez drifted in and out of awareness, his face pale beneath a sheen of rain. When his eyes opened, they always found her. A soldier half his size, carrying him mile after mile through a wilderness that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. Hours blurred. They stopped only when absolutely necessary, 10 minutes for water, a few bites of rations. Each break was brief, silent, heavy with the knowledge that time was their enemy. The cold gnawed deeper with every pause, turning muscles stiff and clumsy. Yet Sarah's pace never faltered. The others began to move differently around her. No more sideways glances or murmured doubts. Their skepticism had been burned away, replaced by a quiet awe that none dared name. When Johnson met her eyes now, there was only respect and something almost protective. Night fell without ceremony. Darkness came like a tide, swallowing the trail until their headlamps carved thin tunnels of light through the sleet. The beam caught flecks of ice, turning the air into a glittering storm. The mountain ridge ahead loomed like the back of some sleeping giant. Rodriguez stirred, voice a rough whisper. "How far?" 6 miles covered, Johnson answered, breath clouding. 5 to go. Sarah didn't speak. Numbers no longer mattered. Only the next step did. They pressed on, The path tightened, the slope steepening until they were forced into single file. To the left, a sheer drop disappeared into black. To the right, a wall of wet rock. The wind rose, a constant roar that carried the scent of pine and danger. "Stay low," Johnson called over the gale. Sarah adjusted her stance, bending slightly to keep the stretcher balanced. Every muscle trembled from hours of exertion, but her mind remained a quiet engine. Weight through the hips, balance, breathe. Behind her, someone slipped, sending a shower of pebbles skittering into the void. No one cursed. Silence was their only language now. Near midnight, they reached a narrow saddle between two peaks. The trail there was barely 3 feet wide, a slick ribbon of rock with nothing but air on either side. The sleet had turned to freezing rain, coating every surface in a treacherous glaze. Johnson's voice was low but urgent. "We wait. This is suicide." Sarah looked ahead, headlamp beam cutting through the storm. The ridge stretched no more than 100 yards before widening again. She felt the weight on her back shift slightly as Rodriguez stirred. "We cross," she said. Johnson stared at her. "You're soaked. You've been carrying him for what, 8 hours, one slip and—" "We cross," she repeated, steady. "Before the temperature drops more, ice will only get worse." For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then Rodriguez rasped from the stretcher, "She's right." Decision made. The soldiers formed a tight formation around her, 2 ahead, 2 behind. Johnson moved to her right flank, eyes never leaving her boots. Sarah stepped onto the ridge. The world fell away. Wind screamed across the gap, tugging at packs and helmets. The beam of her headlamp illuminated nothing but swirling mist and the black void beyond. She placed each foot with surgical precision, testing every slick stone before committing her weight. The stretcher shifted with each gust, a living pendulum she had to counterbalance instinctively. Halfway across, disaster struck. Her left boot skidded on a patch of invisible ice. The stretcher lurched, dragging her sideways toward the abyss. Rodriguez gasped as gravity pulled. Hands shot out from the darkness, Johnson's and Williams's, but they were too far. For a heartbeat, Sarah teetered on the edge, the mountain dropping away beneath her. Time slowed. Breath caught. Then training and sheer will took over. She dropped her center of gravity, knees bending hard, hips twisting to redirect the load. Her core clenched, muscles screaming as she shifted the stretcher back toward balance. Boot found purchase. Weight settled. The world snapped back into motion. She didn't pause. Didn't breathe. One step, then another. Behind her, the squad exhaled as one. When she finally reached the far side, Johnson placed a gloved hand on her shoulder. Just for a second, silent gratitude passing through the touch. Sarah only nodded. There was no triumph in her eyes. Only focus. The hours that followed blurred into an endless climb and descent, the storm never relenting. Her legs shook with each step now. Shoulders throbbed where the stretcher dug deep. Blisters she couldn't feel had long since formed on her feet. But something inside her had shifted beyond pain. It wasn't numbness, it was purpose, pure and unyielding. She thought of her grandfather's quiet voice. "True strength lives here," he'd said, tapping her chest. She felt it now, a steady flame no storm could touch. Around 300, they found a shallow overhang of rock and huddled briefly, sharing water and ration bars. Johnson crouched beside her, eyes searching. "You can stop," he said, not as an order but as a plea. "We can rig another rotation. You've done more than anyone." Sarah shook her head. "We don't stop." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, respect etched deep. Rodriguez stirred, voice barely audible. "Proud of you." She met his gaze, and for the first time since the journey began, allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Dawn arrived reluctantly, a pale smear of light behind heavy clouds. They had covered another 3 miles in the dark. The extraction point lay less than 2 miles ahead, down a steep, unforgiving slope. The path was a chute of slick rock and loose gravel. One wrong move could send them tumbling. Sarah adjusted the stretcher straps, testing the balance. Every muscle protested, but her resolve was unbroken. "Careful on the descent," Johnson said. "We stay close." The group began downward. Gravity became a new enemy. Each step demanded a delicate dance: lean back, brace, slide, catch. The stretcher shifted dangerously on the uneven ground, but Sarah moved as though the mountain itself guided her. Once a rock dislodged and skittered down the slope, vanishing into mist. No one breathed until it disappeared. Halfway down, the clouds parted just enough to reveal a sliver of valley below, a clearing, faint but unmistakable. The extraction point. Hope flared like a sudden spark. "We're close," Williams whispered. Sarah didn't look. She only tightened her grip and kept moving. By late morning, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world washed clean and shining. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. The clouds lifted to reveal distant peaks, their tips catching the first thin sunlight. They reached level ground at last. Across a narrow meadow, the helicopter waited, rotors still, medical team poised. The sight almost undid them. Cheers erupted, raw and unrestrained. But Sarah did not quicken her pace. Not until the stretcher rested on the helicopter's skid and the medics took Rodriguez into their care did she finally allow herself to stop. The release was instant. Her knees buckled. The world tilted. For a heartbeat, she thought she might collapse completely. Johnson caught her elbow, steadying her. "Easy," he said softly. "You did it." She met his eyes, rain-damp hair plastered to her forehead. Words failed. Behind them, the medics worked swiftly, loading Rodriguez aboard. The helicopter's blades began to turn, wind whipping through the clearing. Sarah stepped back, watching as the aircraft lifted into the sky, carrying her sergeant toward safety. Only then, only when the roar of the helicopter faded into the distance, did the weight of the night settle fully upon her. The ache in every muscle. The sting of raw skin beneath soaked fatigues. The knowledge that she had carried another human being across miles of unforgiving mountain in a storm that might have broken them all. And still she stood. The others gathered around her, soldiers who had once doubted, dismissed, even mocked. Their faces now shone with something different. Not pity. Not surprise. Respect pure and unguarded. Johnson removed his helmet, rain dripping from the brim. "I've never seen anything like that," he said quietly. "You saved him. You saved all of us." Sarah only nodded, too tired for words. In the silence that followed, the mountain itself seemed to acknowledge the moment. Wind softened. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the clearing like a benediction. The mission wasn't over. The hike back to base still waited, but something deeper had already been decided. Sarah Martinez, the smallest soldier in the unit, had become its unshakable center. And the story of what she had done was only beginning to spread. Was the hardest part behind them, or had it only just begun? The question lingered as the helicopter's thrum faded into the morning sky, leaving behind a clearing strangely silent after so many hours of storm. The sudden absence of noise felt almost unreal. Wind sighed through the wet pines. Birds, tentative after the night's fury, called from hidden branches. For the first time since the fall, the mountain exhaled. Sarah stood in that quiet, her body swaying slightly with fatigue. Every muscle trembled in small, uncontrollable waves. Her uniform clung damp against bruised skin. She had carried Rodriguez for more than 10 miles of brutal terrain, yet the thought that mattered most was simple: he's alive. He's safe. Around her, the others began to stir from their own stunned stillness. Johnson removed his helmet, rainwater dripping from the rim. "We still have to get out," he said, voice low but steady. No one argued. The extraction was for Rodriguez alone. The rest would hike the remaining miles back to the rendezvous point where trucks waited to haul them to base. There would be no helicopter ride for the uninjured. Sarah adjusted the now lightened straps on her pack, so much lighter without the weight of another human being, and took her place at the rear, the spot she always claimed. But something in the group's formation had shifted. Instead of leaving her behind, they slowed until they moved as a single column, no gaps, no unspoken hierarchy. Johnson glanced back often, not to mock but to guard. The descent was treacherous, but without the stretcher their pace quickened. They moved in near silence, each lost in private thoughts. Occasionally the wind carried a few quiet words, a warning about loose stone, a reminder to hydrate. No more jokes, no impatient sighs. The mountain had burned those things away. Hours later they reached the forest floor where the path widened and the ground softened under a layer of wet pine needles. Afternoon sun filtered through ragged clouds, warm and almost gentle after the long cold. They allowed themselves a short rest beside a fast-moving stream. Soldiers refilled canteens, washed grit from their faces. Sarah crouched at the water's edge, watching the current swirl around her fingers. The icy rush numbed the ache in her hands. Johnson settled beside her, arms resting on his knees. For a while he said nothing. Then, "I was wrong." She looked up. "Back at Bennying," he added, "first week, I figured you washout, weak link, liability." He shook his head, a short laugh without humor. "I've never been so glad to be wrong." Sarah didn't know what to say. The words felt heavier than any pack. She settled on a quiet thanks. He nodded once, eyes on the water. "You carried more than the sergeant out there. You carried all of us." The compliment hung between them, unforced, true. The trucks were waiting when they reached the lower trailhead near dusk. Diesel engines idled, warm air smelling faintly of oil and pine. Soldiers clambered aboard, boots heavy with mud. Sarah followed last, climbing the metal steps one deliberate movement at a time. Every joint protested, but she refused help. The ride back was a blur. Forest gave way to winding road, road to lowland pine, pine to the familiar sprawl of Fort Bennying. Sunset burned orange behind scattered clouds, the day's last light catching the edges of the convoy. Some recruits dozed, heads tipping against windows. Others stared out, silent. Sarah stayed awake. Her body begged for sleep, but her mind hummed with something restless, an awareness that what had happened on the mountain was still unfolding. When the trucks rolled through the gate and onto base, a small crowd was already waiting. Word had traveled faster than their journey. Officers, medics, curious soldiers from other units. News of a diminutive recruit carrying her injured sergeant across miles of storm-swept wilderness had moved through the ranks like an electric current. As Sarah stepped down, the conversations hushed. Faces turned. The attention felt heavier than the stretcher had somehow. She kept her chin level and followed her squad toward the barracks. No salutes, no speeches, just a quiet corridor of watchful eyes. Inside, the familiar scent of canvas and metal bunks grounded her. She stripped off her soaked uniform and stood under a shower that steamed the room. Water stung raw shoulders, traced bruises like invisible ink. When she finally lay on her bunk, sleep came in a sudden, heavy wave. Morning brought sunlight and a base already buzzing. The story had spread overnight, told and retold with small variations but the same astonishment. The smallest soldier had done the impossible. Sarah woke to find two senior officers standing at the barracks entrance. Their presence was enough to draw a respectful silence from every recruit. "Private Martinez," one said, scanning the room until his eyes met hers. "Report." Her heart thudded as she swung her legs from the bunk. Pain shot through calves and shoulders, but she stood straight and followed them outside. They walked her to the infirmary first. Sergeant Rodriguez lay propped in a hospital bed, his leg in a cast, ribs wrapped. His grin widened when he saw her. "Sir," she said, coming to attention. "At ease," he replied, voice still gravelly but strong. "You saved my life, Martinez. No debate, no exaggeration. You carried me out when none of us thought it possible." She started to protest. It was a team effort, but he lifted a hand. "Don't, everyone here knows what you did." For a long moment they simply looked at each other, soldier to soldier. No more doubts, no more quiet tests, mutual recognition. By midday, the base commander requested her presence in the operations building. There, under the bright glare of fluorescent lights, Sarah recounted every step of the mission for the official after-action report. Senior officers listened without interruption, occasionally exchanging glances as she described distances, terrain, the hours of relentless carrying. When she finished, the colonel leaned back, fingers steepled. "Your endurance and initiative likely saved Sergeant Rodriguez's life," he said. "We'll be recommending you for commendation." The words landed softly but carried weight. Commendation meant more than a medal. It meant that what she had done would be entered into record, studied, remembered. Sarah nodded, unsure what else to offer. Praise had never been her goal. She only wanted to do her duty. As she left the building, late afternoon sun spilled across the parade ground. Recruits passed, some offering quick salutes, others simple nods of respect. The same soldiers who once laughed when she lagged behind now stepped aside, giving her room without a word. That evening her squad gathered in the mess hall. Conversation was quieter than usual, less boisterous. Johnson sat across from her, a rare smile breaking his usually guarded expression. "You know, the whole base is talking," he said. "Even the drill sergeants. Some of them bet you wouldn't last a week. Now they're telling rookies about you like you're a legend." Sarah shook her head, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "I just did what needed doing." "Exactly," Johnson said. "That's the point." The others nodded, Williams, Lee, Hernandez, all the ones who had once kept their distance. Their eyes held the same unspoken admission. She had earned their respect in a way no rank or medal could command. For the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, Sarah felt the quiet warmth of belonging. Not because she had proven them wrong, but because they finally understood what she had known all along. That strength wasn't measured in size or noise, but in the refusal to quit. Weeks passed. Rodriguez recovered steadily, moving from hospital bed to crutches to slow, careful steps. Each time Sarah visited, he greeted her with a grin and a joke about getting carried around like a king. But beneath the humor lay a gravity neither of them ignored. They had shared a crucible, and it had changed them both. Meanwhile, the story of the mountain rescue became part of base lore. New recruits heard it during orientation. Drill sergeants used it as a lesson in perseverance. Officers referenced it in briefings about grit and adaptability. Sarah's name became shorthand for quiet endurance. She noticed the shift in small ways. Salutes held a fraction longer, questions asked with genuine curiosity, invitations to advanced training sessions she hadn't yet qualified for on paper. None of it inflated her. If anything, it humbled her more. Her parents arrived for a weekend visit soon after. They stood at the edge of the parade ground as she approached, their faces a mirror of pride and disbelief. Her mother's eyes filled before a single word was spoken. Her father, a former Marine whose doubts had always been carefully hidden, saluted her with crisp precision before pulling her into a fierce embrace. "You've shown the world what I always hoped you had," he whispered. "Strength where it matters." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "I just kept going," she said. "That's everything," he replied. The commendation ceremony came a month later. Dress uniforms, flags snapping in the autumn breeze, rows of soldiers standing in precise formation. Senior officers spoke of courage, of selfless service, of a mission that could have ended in tragedy but instead became a testament to human will. When her name was called, Sarah stepped forward, spine straight, eyes steady. The medal was pinned to her chest, the citation read aloud to gathered ranks. Applause rolled across the parade ground like distant thunder. As she stood at attention, sunlight warmed her face. She thought of the mountain, the cold wind, the sleet, the endless steps. She thought of the moment when every instinct had screamed to stop and how she had simply not. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And that, she realized, was enough. What happens after the story is told? The question followed Sarah through the weeks that trailed the commendation ceremony, like the echo of a bell that refuses to fade. The bass soon settled back into its familiar rhythm, marching drills at dawn, weapons checks in the harsh light of midday, the constant hum of engines and orders. But everywhere she went, Sarah felt the subtle shift, the invisible current her actions had set in motion. At the range, younger recruits straightened a little when she passed. In the mess hall, conversations dimmed, then brightened with quiet respect. No one announced it aloud, but the smallest soldier in the company had become a quiet standard, a reminder of what could be endured and achieved when there seemed to be nothing left. Sarah moved through it all with the same deliberate pace that had carried her across the mountain. She didn't linger in praise, didn't lean into the sudden notoriety. She focused instead on the next requirement, the next challenge. Because beyond the admiration lay something more demanding, the weight of expectation. Advanced training came first. 2 weeks after the ceremony, her commanding officer summoned her to his office, a space lined with maps and the faint smell of old leather. "Martinez," he said, studying her file, "we're recommending you for Pathfinder School, navigation and field leadership. It's not a small step, fewer than half make it through." Sarah listened, hands clasped behind her back, the memory of icy ridges and endless steps flickering behind her eyes. "I'll go," she said simply. He nodded, a glint of approval in his expression. "I thought you'd say that." The school was notoriously grueling, complex navigation drills through dense wilderness, leadership exercises under sleep deprivation, tasks designed to expose every weakness. But the mountain had already taught Sarah what true fatigue felt like. She approached each trial as she had the rescue, one step, one breath, one decision at a time. By the end of the course, her instructors noted something unusual in their reports. A candidate who rarely spoke but whose quiet steadiness drew others to follow. When the final evaluations were read aloud, Sarah's name sat near the top. Back at Fort Benning, her unit had changed too. Johnson, once her loudest skeptic, had become an unexpected ally. He shadowed her during ruck marches, not out of doubt but camaraderie, often matching her slower, measured pace instead of surging ahead. During night exercises, he asked her advice on route planning, acknowledging her unmatched sense of terrain. One evening after training, he caught her as she stowed her gear. "You ever think about how weird this is?" he asked, a faint grin softening the scar on his jaw. "I used to joke about you holding us back. Now I'm trying to keep up." Sarah shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Mountains change people." "Guess they do," he said, and the grin turned thoughtful. Others sought her out as well. Recruits who once kept their distance now asked quiet questions after lights out, about endurance, about fear, about how to keep moving when every part of you wants to stop. Sarah never gave speeches. She offered what she knew: breathe, plan, take the next step. Her words were simple, but the recruits listened as if they carried the weight of scripture. Letters from home took on a new tone. Her mother wrote of pride, without the quiet worry that had colored earlier notes. Her father's letters were shorter, steadier, less advice, more quiet acknowledgement. One envelope carried only a single sentence in his deliberate handwriting: "You carry our name well." Sarah read it 3 times before folding it carefully into her locker. Months turned to seasons. The winter wind sharpened across the base, and with it came new responsibilities. Sarah was assigned to assist in training a fresh batch of recruits, an unofficial role at first, then one written into orders. She guided them through navigation drills, patient but unyielding, insisting on precision and discipline. Many of the young soldiers arrived with the same restless bravado she had once faced in others. Some were taller, stronger, certain of their own superiority. Sarah watched their movements with a quiet knowing. She recognized the doubt that would eventually find them, the wall every soldier hits when strength runs out and only will remains. During one particularly bitter night exercise, a 19-year-old recruit named Taylor collapsed halfway through a 10-mile march, knees buckling in the cold. The platoon slowed, murmuring about whether he'd make it back. Sarah knelt beside him, eyes level. "Breathe," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's just another step. You can always take one more." He looked at her, shivering, and somehow stood. The march continued. Later, he told his bunkmates that her words had carried him farther than his own muscles. Stories like that began to circulate almost as quickly as the tale of the mountain rescue. Rodriguez returned to duty in early spring. His leg healed, though he moved with a slight limp. When Sarah first saw him back in uniform, standing at the edge of the training field, a quiet relief settled over her. "Sergeant," she greeted, saluting sharply. He returned it with a small smile. "I see they didn't break you yet." "Not yet," she replied. They walked the perimeter together, an easy silence between them. Finally he said, "You changed something out there, not just for me, for all of us." Sarah looked out at the recruits moving through drills in the fading light. "I didn't mean to." "That's exactly why it matters," Rodriguez said. "The ones who don't chase recognition are the ones who deserve it most." As months passed, Sarah found that the true impact of that single night in the mountains wasn't in medals or base-wide stories. It was in the way people carried themselves after meeting her. Recruits who had doubted their own worth stood a little taller. Seasoned soldiers found a new patience for those who struggled. The quiet culture of mockery that had once lingered in barracks corners softened, replaced by a grudging understanding. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, Sarah walked alone to the edge of the training grounds. The sky would just be turning pale, the air cool and damp. She'd watch the first light slip across the parade field and think of the ridge where sleet turned to ice, of the endless steps that had felt like eternity. She remembered the precise stillness of that moment when she nearly fell, and the certainty that if she slipped, no one could save them. It wasn't fear she felt when she remembered, it was clarity. One evening, months after the rescue, she received an unexpected invitation, a regional leadership conference for non-commissioned officers and advanced trainees. The keynote speaker, a decorated colonel, spoke about resilience, the quiet force that sustains soldiers when the mission stretches beyond endurance. Midway through, he paused, scanning the crowd. "Some of you know the story of Private Sarah Martinez," he said. "A soldier who taught us that resilience isn't a slogan, it's a choice, one step after another when everything in you screams to stop." Heads turned. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't been warned. The colonel continued, "Strength isn't muscle, strength is commitment." Applause followed, low at first, then swelling until it filled the hall. Sarah sat very still, humbled, wishing only to slip quietly away. But inside, she felt a calm acceptance. The story wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to every soldier who needed a reminder that limits are often illusions. Years later, when she would mentor younger soldiers, Sarah rarely mentioned the mountain. She preferred to listen rather than retell. Yet the lesson of that night threaded through every word of guidance she offered. "Don't measure yourself against anyone else," she'd tell them. "You'll lose every time. Measure by the step you can take today that you couldn't take yesterday. That's strength." Recruits leaned in when she spoke. sensing the truth beneath her quiet voice. Sometimes, when the base was still and moonlight silvered the parade ground, Sarah thought about how unexpectedly everything had unfolded. She'd come to the army to prove something, maybe to herself, maybe to the shadows of family history. She'd been laughed at, underestimated, nearly broken. And yet the moment that defined her had not been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about choosing to move forward when stopping would have been easier. One step, one breath, over and over until the mission was done. She understood now that this was the heart of soldiering and of life. Strength isn't a shout, it's a whisper that refuses to be silenced. The commendation medal hung in her locker, polished but rarely displayed. Visitors sometimes asked to see it, expecting a story of daring heroics. She would hand it over without flourish and say only, "I kept going." And in those 3 words lay every icy mile, every aching muscle, every quiet moment of decision that had carried her and a fellow soldier safely home. How do you lead when you never sought the spotlight? The question surfaced more often as Sarah's name traveled farther than she ever imagined. Months had passed since the storm and the rescue, yet the story refused to fade. It wasn't just barracks talk anymore. Regional training posts invited her to speak. Articles in military newsletters described her as the soldier who carried a sergeant across the mountains. She hadn't asked for any of it, but the recognition kept coming, and with it came a new challenge, becoming a leader others instinctively followed. Her first formal assignment as a squad leader arrived on a humid spring morning. Orders delivered crisp and simple. She would take charge of a group of 10 new recruits fresh from civilian life. Most were taller, louder, and several years younger. When she stepped into the training bay for the first briefing, conversation faltered. The recruits had heard the stories, of course they had, and their eyes carried a mix of curiosity and quiet awe. Sarah's stomach tightened. She wasn't a storyteller. She wasn't the kind to command with volume or swagger. She cleared her throat. "You know why you're here," she said, voice low but steady. "Your job is to give everything you have even when it feels like you've got nothing left. I won't shout, I won't chase you, but I will notice, and I expect you to notice yourselves." Silence followed, not defiance, attention. The weeks that followed tested her in unexpected ways. Some recruits arrived with overconfidence, their strength obvious but their patience thin. Others struggled quietly, hiding doubt behind forced bravado. Sarah recognized each type. She had been their shadow and their mirror. On long marches she stayed near the back, watching for the small signs of unraveling, the twitch of a cramped calf, the flicker of panic in a too wide eye. She offered guidance in a few spare words. "Breathe. Slow your rhythm. Focus on the next step." She never gave speeches. She simply walked beside them until the distance no longer seemed impossible. By the end of their first month, the squad's cohesion was unmistakable. Stronger soldiers slowed without complaint to help the weaker. The constant, cutting jokes that had once defined her own early days faded before they could even start. When asked about their transformation during evaluations, one recruit shrugged and said, "Sergeant Martinez doesn't tell us to be a team. She just is the team." Yet leadership brought new tension. Late at night, after lights out, Sarah sometimes lay awake staring at the dim ceiling, the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. It wasn't the physical demands, those she understood. It was the quiet question of whether she was shaping these young soldiers in a way that would hold under fire. What if her silence left too much unsaid? What if her steadiness failed to prepare them for chaos? Memories of the mountain surfaced unbidden, the near slip on the icy ridge, the sense that one misstep would undo everything. Back then the choice had been clear, move forward or stop. Now the path was more complicated. She sought guidance from Rodriguez, who had returned to full duty, his limp barely visible but his presence as commanding as ever. They met after evening drills, walking the perimeter where twilight brushed the trees with violet light. "You ever worry you're not enough?" she asked quietly. Rodriguez regarded her for a long moment. "Every good leader worries that," he said. "The bad ones never do." He paused, then added, "You lead the way you carried me. You watch every step. You don't let go. That's more than enough." His words didn't erase her doubts, but they steadied her, like a hand on the stretcher when the path narrows. By midsummer, Sarah's unit received orders for a multi-week field deployment in rugged country, not unlike the mountains that had tested her months before. This time she would not follow, she would command. Preparation became a quiet obsession. She studied maps late into the night, tracing routes with a fingertip, memorizing terrain features as if each line were a lifeline. She drilled her squad on navigation and contingency planning, teaching them the subtle art of reading the land when compasses failed. When they finally set out, the recruits moved with a discipline that surprised even the senior officers. Over steep ridges and through deep forest, they functioned as a single organism, watchful, adaptive, resilient. During one night march, a violent thunderstorm swept across the hills, turning trails to rivers of mud. A younger soldier slipped into a gully, panic flashing in his eyes as water surged around his legs. Before anyone else reacted, Sarah was there, sure-footed in the slick darkness. She crouched, offered a steady hand, and spoke with a calm that cut through the roar of rain. "Plant your feet, breathe, one step at a time." The soldier found his footing. They climbed out together, soaked but safe. Later, when he tried to thank her, she simply said, "We don't leave anyone behind," and moved on. Word of her leadership filtered back to headquarters. Officers noted not just her competence, but the almost intangible effect she had on morale. Soldiers returned from the field speaking of a calm that steadied them when fear threatened to take hold. One captain summarized it in his report: "Martinez leads with presence, not volume. Troops move as though her steadiness transfers to them." Sarah read the line during her evaluation and felt a quiet recognition. Presence, not volume. That was the only way she knew how to lead. Her growing reputation brought new invitations: advanced survival courses, cross-training with specialized units, advisory roles in strategy sessions usually reserved for higher ranks. Each offer carried opportunity, but also a subtle pressure. During one evening briefing, a senior officer suggested she consider the Ranger pipeline, a path demanding not only physical endurance, but a willingness to fight in ways that rarely made the official commendations. "You've proven you can handle the grind," he said. "The question is whether you want to." Sarah considered the offer in silence. She thought of the mountain again, of the way her strength had been measured not in aggression, but in resolve. She wondered if chasing another badge would mean chasing someone else's idea of heroism instead of her own quiet standard. "I'll think on it," she said finally. And she meant it. Letters from home continued to arrive, each carrying a different kind of pride. Her father wrote of watching new recruits salute her during a recent base visit. Her mother included clippings of articles from local newspapers, each headline more dramatic than the last. Sarah smiled at their exaggerations but folded each letter carefully, tucking them beside the medal she rarely displayed. To her, the words from family mattered more than the articles, proof that the people who once feared for her now trusted the strength she had found. As summer burned into late autumn, Sarah took on a quieter mission of her own, mentoring soldiers who struggled as she once had. She sought them out, the ones who lagged behind on runs, the ones whose eyes held that flicker of "I don't belong here." She never started with lectures. She started with small actions, running a few extra laps beside them, demonstrating how to adjust a pack for better balance, sharing the breathing techniques that had carried her across those endless miles. Sometimes she told fragments of her own story, never the full heroic arc the base loved to repeat, just the truth they needed. I was last in everything. People laughed. I stayed, that's all. For many, that was enough. One cool evening, she returned from a long day of drills to find Rodriguez waiting near the training field. The setting sun painted the horizon in deep amber. "Word is you've been turning half the base into endurance machines," he said, smiling. "Just sharing what I know," she replied. They walked the perimeter again, as they often did. "You realize," he said after a time, "that what you did on that mountain keeps teaching people, long after the moment passed." Sarah looked toward the darkening tree line, the memory of sleet and wind alive in her mind. "I didn't carry him to teach anyone," she said softly. Rodriguez nodded. "Exactly why it teaches." Later that night, Sarah sat alone in the quiet barracks. Outside, the moon cast a silver sheen across the parade ground, the same ground where she had once felt invisible. She thought about the path ahead, promotions, maybe ranger school, perhaps even officer training if she chose. Opportunities stretched before her like another mountain range, each peak demanding a different kind of climb. But the decision no longer felt like a race to prove worth. It felt like a continuation of the same quiet journey, one step, one breath, guided not by the need to be seen but by the certainty of purpose. She touched the metal in her locker, cool against her fingertips, and closed the door. Strength didn't need to shine, it only needed to endure. And in the stillness she knew, whatever came next, whether battlefields or classrooms, commands or quiet mentoring, she would meet it the same way she had met the mountain. One deliberate step at a time. What does strength become when it turns into legacy? The thought surfaced as Sarah watched a new group of recruits march across the dawn-lit field, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Years had passed since the mountain rescue, yet the memory remained a constant undertone, a steady drumbeat beneath the daily cadence of military life. She stood now not as a junior soldier but as a seasoned non-commissioned officer, her uniform bearing stripes that spoke of experience and earned trust. Young soldiers saluted when she approached, eyes reflecting the stories they'd heard. She returned each gesture with quiet precision, never rushing the moment, never letting it feel mechanical. Her reputation had long outgrown the base at Fort Benning. Invitations arrived weekly, training commands requesting her insight on endurance programs, leadership schools asking her to speak about resilience. Articles continued to circulate in military journals, describing her as the soldier who redefined perseverance. Sarah accepted only a fraction of the requests, choosing carefully. She still believed that strength lived in action more than in words. Yet she recognized that stories, especially true ones, could build bridges for those struggling in silence. When she did speak, her voice remained measured, deliberate. "I'm not here to tell you to be heroes," she would begin. "I'm here to remind you that the hardest battles are rarely loud. They're the ones you fight when no one is watching, when it's just you and the next step." In every audience, she saw the same flicker of recognition. Soldiers remembering nights of doubt, recruits reconsidering their own limits. Her days on base evolved into a rhythm of training, mentoring, and quiet study. She oversaw navigation courses, taught field survival, and often accompanied units on endurance drills through thick pine and rolling hills. One evening, a young specialist named Carter approached her after a grueling march. He had lagged far behind the unit earlier, frustration etched into every line of his face. "Ma'am," he said, hesitating on the word though she wasn't an officer, "how do you keep going when everything in you says you can't?" Sarah regarded him with the same calm she once found in Rodriguez's eyes. "You don't think about the finish," she said. "You think about the next breath, the next step. That's all it ever is." Carter nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Next step," he repeated, as if testing the truth on his tongue. Despite the steady rhythm of her career, moments of doubt still visited Sarah in the quiet hours. Sometimes it came as a whisper when she stared across the darkened parade ground late at night. Is this enough? The Army offered paths she hadn't taken: ranger school, officer commissioning, assignments overseas. She had turned down several, not from fear but from a sense that chasing rank for its own sake wasn't her calling. Still, she wondered, was she hiding in the familiar, or was she honoring the quiet purpose that had guided her from the start? During one of these restless nights she sought out Rodriguez, now a senior instructor whose limp had softened with time. They walked the edge of the training field, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. "You ever wonder if staying put is a kind of running away?" she asked. He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting years of hard-earned understanding. "Only if you're ignoring a pull you can't quiet," he said. "But if you're where you serve best, that's not running, that's choosing." His words settled into her like steady rain. Not long after, the Army called again, this time with an opportunity she hadn't anticipated. A new joint task force was forming to train Allied soldiers in rugged mountain warfare. They wanted Sarah not for a medal or a speech, but for her method, her unique blend of endurance, strategy, and quiet leadership. It would mean months away, in terrain as harsh as any she had faced. It would mean starting over with soldiers from different nations, different languages, different assumptions. It would mean in every way a new climb. She said yes. The assignment took her high into a mountain range halfway around the world, where snowfields stretched beneath a sky so blue it looked almost unreal. Here, altitude became an invisible enemy, thinning the air until every breath burned. Her team of multinational soldiers, Americans, Norwegians, Nepalese, Canadians, arrived strong but untested. Many underestimated the mountains. Sarah recognized the signs: the confident stride that slowed too soon, the subtle panic when lungs refused to fill. She taught them as she always had, without speeches, without bravado. She moved steadily, explained quietly, demonstrated how to read the land when maps lied and compasses faltered. When storms came, she led them through whiteout conditions with a calm that anchored even the most seasoned climbers. Soldiers who barely shared a language learned to follow her gestures, her deliberate pace, the silent assurance in every step. By the end of the deployment, the multinational unit had completed every objective with 0 serious injuries, a rarity in such punishing conditions. Commanders credited Sarah's leadership as the defining factor. The recognition that followed surprised her less this time. When she returned stateside, commendations awaited along with another invitation, a keynote address at the Army's annual leadership summit. Senior officers, cadets, and civilian officials would attend. She considered declining. The spotlight still made her uneasy, but Rodriguez, now her friend as much as mentor, insisted. "They don't need another speech about strategy," he said. "They need to hear from someone who knows that strength isn't noise." And so, weeks later, Sarah stepped onto a wide stage beneath bright lights. Rows of uniforms stretched before her. Cameras flashed. She began as always, simply. "I was never the fastest, never the strongest," she said, voice steady. "Some of you know the story of a mountain, a stretcher, and a storm. But that night wasn't about heroics. It was about refusal, refusal to stop when every reason told me to." She let the silence settle. The room listened as if the air itself held its breath. "Strength isn't something you display," she continued. "It's something you decide, one breath, one step, and then another." Applause rose, not loud at first but deep, like distant thunder rolling closer. Sarah stood still, allowing the sound to wash over her without owning it. The story belonged to everyone who had ever faced the edge of endurance. Back at Fort Benning, life resumed its quieter rhythm. Sarah returned to early runs, to patient instruction, to evenings spent beneath a sky dense with stars. The accolades faded into background noise as they always did. What remained were the soldiers she trained, the ones who carried fragments of her lesson into places she might never see. Carter, now a squad leader himself, wrote from a deployment overseas. "I remembered your words when the heat made every mile feel impossible. Next step. It worked." Letters like his arrived often, sometimes months or years later, each a reminder that her strength had rippled outward, shaping people she might never meet. One evening she walked the perimeter alone, the air cool with approaching winter. Moonlight silvered the training fields, the same ground where she had once been an unsure recruit trying to prove herself. She paused at the edge of the woods and let the memory of the mountain return, not as a burden but as a quiet companion. The cold wind, the weight of the stretcher, the moment she nearly slipped into the void. What stayed with her wasn't the fear or even the triumph. It was the decision. The simple, unyielding choice to keep going. That choice, she realized, was the true legacy. Not the medals, not the speeches, the decision itself, a gift she had carried forward and passed on to others. The night was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves. Sarah closed her eyes, breathing in the cool air. Somewhere out there, soldiers she had never met were facing their own ridges, their own storms, their own impossible loads. She hoped they would remember. Strength doesn't shout. It simply takes the next step. When does a story truly end? The thought followed Sarah across the parade ground in the cool hush of early morning. Years had passed since the storm-swept mountain, but time had only deepened the echo of that night. Promotions had come, sergeant, then staff sergeant, and with them the weight of steady responsibility. Yet beneath every new stripe beat the same quiet rhythm, one breath, one step. The base was still, wrapped in silver light. Beyond the barracks, pine trees swayed gently, their shadows long and soft. She paused, breathing in the familiar scent of damp earth and engine oil, and felt the history of the place settle around her like a well-worn coat. Today was her last official day in uniform. The decision to leave hadn't come suddenly. It had arrived like dawn, slow and certain, a light that couldn't be ignored. She served more than a decade guiding recruits, leading field missions, shaping soldiers who now carried their own squads through darkness and doubt. But a quiet pull had begun to grow, a desire to teach beyond the army, to help young people, soldiers or not, find the kind of strength she discovered on that mountain. It wasn't a rejection of service. It was an evolution of it. Rodriguez had been the first to know. They walked the perimeter one cool evening, as they had countless times before. "You're not leaving the work," he said after she explained. "You're just taking it farther." She nodded, a small, steady smile on her lips. "That's how it feels." Her final formation assembled just after sunrise. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, faces lit by a soft, amber glow. Among them were men and women she had trained, mentored, carried through nights of rain and miles of unforgiving ground. The commanding officer spoke of her service, of missions completed, recruits inspired, lives steadied by her presence. He recounted the mountain rescue in simple, reverent terms, though Sarah never liked to hear it described as heroism. When her name was called, she stepped forward, the click of her boots crisp against the concrete. Applause rose, rolling across the field like a low tide. She saluted sharply, then lowered her hand and let her eyes travel across the ranks. She recognized faces, some hardened by deployments, others still wide with the eagerness of new recruits. All of them had their own ridges to cross. Her voice carried evenly, without flourish. "You already know what matters," she said. "It isn't speed or size, it isn't medals. It's the choice you make when you think you can't take another step, and you do anyway." Silence followed, not from disinterest but from understanding. Then a single soldier started to clap. Another joined. Soon the entire formation echoed with the sound, not raucous but deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the ground itself. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, she removed her uniform for the last time. The fabric smelled faintly of field dust and pine. She smoothed the sleeves with a kind of reverence before folding it carefully into her duffel. In the locker rested her medal and the letters from family and soldiers alike, pages creased from years of unfolding and reading. She picked up one from Specialist Carter, now a platoon leader, who had written just weeks ago from a deployment overseas. "Sergeant, I thought of you when we were pinned down in the desert heat. I told my squad, one more step. We made it through, thank you." Sarah held the letter for a long moment, feeling the quiet continuum of endurance stretch across continents. The world beyond the gate welcomed her with a different kind of silence. No cadence calls, no shouted orders, just the wind through tall grass and the distant hum of highway traffic. She walked alone toward the small civilian car she'd purchased for the life ahead. Her next chapter waited, an outdoor leadership program for youth and veterans, a space where she could teach what the mountain had taught her. There would be no medals there, no formal ranks, just young people standing at the edge of their own limits. Driving away, she caught a final glimpse of the training fields in the rearview mirror. For a heartbeat, she saw her younger self, the recruit who lagged behind, who carried doubt like extra weight, who refused to stop. She smiled, not with pride but with recognition. That girl had carried her farther than anyone else ever could. Months later, she stood atop a different ridge, this one in the quiet wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, where evergreen forests rolled to the horizon. Around her, a group of teenagers and a few veterans rested after a long climb. Some sat on rocks, chests heaving, eyes wide at the view. One young woman, no older than Sarah had been on that first day at Fort Benning, approached with hesitation. "Ma'am," she said, "I didn't think I could make it, but you said just keep moving. One step, I did." Sarah felt the faintest breeze cross the ridge, cool and sure. She placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder and nodded. "That's all it ever is," she replied. The girl smiled, tired, triumphant. Around them, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the peaks. Later, as evening settled, Sarah sat alone near the campfire. Flames flickered, sending sparks into the vast night sky. She tilted her head back and studied the constellations. Somewhere, far away, soldiers she had trained were leading their own missions, facing their own storms. Somewhere, someone was taking the next step because of a lesson passed quietly from one heart to another. She thought again of that mountain years ago, the freezing sleet, the weight of the stretcher, the long dark hours when the world narrowed to a single footfall. What had seemed like an ending then had in truth been a beginning. Strength, she realized, is not a moment. It is a lifetime of moments. It does not fade when the uniform comes off. It lives in each choice to continue, in every quiet act of endurance that no one may ever see. The fire crackled softly. A shooting star traced a silent arc across the sky. Sarah breathed in the cool night air and felt a peace that asked for nothing more. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.